What's up guys, today I'm going to be explaining exposure for you, helping you understand it for when you want to use it on a manual or any other non-auto mode. And basically this is something that I did and it really helped me go from amateur, complete amateur to sort of pro level now. So let's get right into it. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to go over is what is exposure? Well, there's a couple of different definitions, but let's say it's the amount of light that reaches your camera's sensor. So the way that the light is spread and the different intensity of the light in different areas is what makes up your picture. But what changes how your final picture will actually look and what makes the light more or less intense? Well, this is where the three elements of exposure come in. These three things each provide light to the sensor in their own way, and each picture you take will always use these three things. So you could think of it a bit like darts. You've got three darts and each one could get a different value for your score, but they all add up to that final score, and that's what the exposure is. So the three things, the darts, that add up to that final exposure, which is the score, are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So what are these three things? So inside each lens, there's an aperture ring. It's a weird bladed ring thing, and it can open up wider or smaller to let more or less light in. When it's open as wide as it can go, it's obviously letting more light in than when it's really small. You might have seen F numbers such as f4.0. That's an aperture rating. The lower that number, the wider the ring, and the more light is let in. For example, f1.8 lets in more light than f2.8 because the ring is wider. You can think of the aperture a bit like a security guard outside of the Supreme store on a release day, and the people being the light. They could let more people in, but they don't always want to. So with aperture, we can control how much light is let in just by the size of the ring. However, we might not want to use aperture, we might want to use a different source of light, such as shutter speed. So shutter speed is probably the most self-explanatory out of the three. In front of your camera's sensor, there's basically something stopping the light getting in. The shutter speed is how long the light coming through the lens is actually allowed to hit the sensor for. So the light's coming through the lens, going through the aperture ring, and then we're allowing that light to hit the sensor for a certain amount of time, which is defined by the shutter speed. The longer the shutter speed, the longer the sensor is open and exposed to light. The longer the sensor's being hit with the light, the brighter the image will be at the end. For example, we've got a shutter speed of half a second and an aperture of f4. We have a shutter speed of 1 second and an aperture of f4. So the 1 second shutter speed is twice as long as the half a second. So the sensor is going to be exposed to light for twice as long when it's 1 second as when it's half a second. So if it's being exposed to light twice the amount of time, the sensor is going to capture twice as much light and the image will be twice as bright. Simple, right? Now you can see how the aperture directly relates to the shutter speed because that light will have already passed through the aperture ring, which might have already restricted some of the light available to it. Imagine it like this. It's raining outside and we put a bucket out to catch the rain. The aperture is how wide the bucket is. The wider it is, the more rain it will catch. And the shutter speed is how long we leave the bucket outside for. The longer we leave it outside, again, the more rain it will catch. Now on to the final of the three, ISO. So ISO is like the sensitivity value of the sensor, like how hard the sensor is listening, how hard it's working to try and pick up that light. If there's a lot of light, the camera's sensor's not got a problem capturing that. But if there isn't much light available, the camera's got to try harder and ramp up that signal to try and pick up that light that's not actually coming through. So the higher the ISO, the more sensitive the camera's sensor is. Let's run through that example again. The intensity of light would be how hard the rain is falling. The aperture would be the size of our bucket. The shutter speed is how long we leave the bucket out in the rain for. And I guess ISO would be how much rain light is needed to fill that bucket. At a higher ISO, the bucket would be very shallow and we wouldn't need much rain to actually fill that bucket. We wouldn't need much light to actually get that correct exposure because the ISO helps us out with that. So at a high ISO, we've got less light coming in, but we need less light to make the correct exposure. You've now heard the three sides of what's commonly referred to as the exposure triangle. So why is it called an exposure triangle? Why is it called this? All three parts are directly related and we can use different amounts to get the correct exposure. If we want, we can make our aperture ring smaller and our shutter speed higher. Or we can make our shutter speed smaller and our ISO higher. Or you can mix and match these things in any way you want to get the correct exposure. That's why it's called the triangle. As a side note, I've mentioned correct exposure a few times now, but what is that? I'm going to very quickly talk about dynamic range first. Dynamic range is how bright of an area and how dark of an area the sensor can capture of the same image. Because one area could be really, really dark and one area could be really, really bright, and the sensors actually struggle to capture this. So the difference between the dark area and the bright area is dynamic range. Once the sensor starts to lose detail in the very, very dark areas or the very, very light areas, that's called clipping, and we don't want that. Okay, back to correct exposure now. Correct exposure is what the camera judges to be the best amount of light, not too dark, not too light, between those dark and bright areas in the image. So in simple terms, it's just trying to find the best balance between the dark areas and the bright areas in the image. That's the camera's version of correct exposure, but it's really up to us how we want the picture to turn out. We can mix and match ISO, aperture and shutter speed any way we want to get the correct value for exposure. But why would we want to mix and match them though? What difference does it make? Why might we want to use more of one than the other? Well, I'm going to go through the pros and cons of using each light source. So first, aperture. Aperture controls the depth of field you'll get. If you look at some of the pictures I'm putting on screen, depth of field allows you to isolate a part of the picture and creates pleasing background and or foreground blur. This blur is often referred to as bokeh. Although a picture doesn't have to have shallow depth of field, it's commonly seen as what gives that picture a cinematic look or a professional look. Especially in portraits, sports and crowds, being able to draw someone's eye to a specific part of the image is what makes aperture a favourite. The lower the f number, for example f1.4, the wider the ring, the more light's let in, and as a side effect, the shallower depth of field you'll have. For example, using an aperture of f1.2 on someone's face, it's likely that their eyes will be in focus, but their nose and ears will be out of focus. The higher the f number, for example f16, less light is let in, and as a side effect, the greater the depth of field. When doing landscape photography, for example, you'd often want the whole scene to be as sharp as possible and in focus. So you might want to use an aperture of like f16. Having a wider aperture can be really useful in low light, and it also improves autofocus performance. So as you can see, it doesn't really have any downsides, apart from cost. Having a low f number is one of the main things that can make certain lenses really expensive. Now on to shutter speed. With shutter speed, you can give an image more or less motion blur. Most of the time you want your shutter speed to be as high as possible, really, to be able to get like crisp, sharp pictures. Look at this picture I took on screen, and you can see that with a high shutter speed, motion is frozen perfectly. Just like in this image, where you can see the balls in mid-air captured very sharply, and it's because it's got a high shutter speed. If it was a slower shutter speed, it would be the ball. You could see the ball trailing across the screen, but also he would be trailing too. So it's the parts of the image that are moving that will be affected by shutter speed. There are times where you want to use a low shutter speed though, for example, long exposures, which are very, very slow shutter speeds normally, and they allow you to capture the scene as it changes over time. Also in this fireworks picture, you can see how the trails of light of the fireworks are caught like over various seconds. So if you like, that's another example. Or like you might have seen light trail photography before, where you can see lots of like the light trails going along. That's long exposure. If you look at this astrophotography shot, you can see where the planes crossed my image actually during when I took the picture. And you can see it's left its course as the shutter speed was like several seconds long. You can actually see like the little dots and the actual trail of where it is on the top in the left-hand side. Now on to ISO. When there isn't enough light, ISO can make up the difference, but at a cost. Imagine this. You're in a forest and you have a microphone and you speak into it like here for like 1 meter distance, right? And it picks up fine what you're saying. And then you do the same thing, but you put the microphone like 10 meters away and you shout and it can hear you, right? It's still picking up what you're saying. But when you go and play that back in your headphones later on and you got to turn the volume up really loud, you're going to be able to hear like other things as well. Like you hear like annoying like foresty sounds like owls, cuckoo, whatever. Anyway, and you hear like loads of other noise, ambient noise and stuff. And that's pretty much a good example of the same with ISO. So it's trying harder to listen to it. It's like it's further away, imagine, but it's less light coming in. And it's trying its best to like pick out that light. But because of that, you actually end up getting more noise come through. It tries hard to read the light, which leads to unwanted noise, mainly from heat coming from the sensor. But we don't really need to know that. All we need to know is that the higher the ISO, the less quality the image basically. It's going to start deteriorating as soon as you go higher and higher and higher. Normally you can get away with most cameras. It depends on every camera, but most cameras you can normally get away with at least up to 800 without even seeing any much difference at all. But when you start pushing beyond like 3200 and stuff, you'll start noticing big differences depending on which camera you're using. Big differences, and you can't do as much with it. The picture starts to deteriorate. So it really depends on which camera you're using, but you just want to know generally that the lower you can keep that ISO, the better. On most cameras, the lowest possible is 100, and sometimes it's 200 or 50, but lowest possible is normally 100, and the higher they normally go up to about 6,400 or higher. But a lot of that isn't actually usable. When it gets past 6,400 on most cameras, it's not really usable. So now you know the 3 paths of exposure and how changing these individually can affect the look of the final image. Now you need to know how you can balance them when mixing the values to get the correct exposure. You know, earlier I was saying about how a 1 second shutter speed would let in twice as much light as a half a second shutter speed. Because the sensor is exposed for twice the amount of time, so twice the amount of light comes in. And that makes the picture twice as bright. Well, you can do this with aperture and ISO too. In photography, there's something called a stop. And the best way to look at this is like an interchangeable unit between aperture, ISO, and shutter speed, where you can add a stop to something of one of them and then deduct a stop from the other one, or like you can mix around the values, but they correlate to each other. Plus one stop is doubling the light. So as I said earlier, with the half a second and a second, so that's plus one stop. And if you're going the other way around, if you're going from 1 second to half a second shutter speed, that's minus one stop. It's halving the light, halving the amount of light in the final image. Our camera actually lets us like use up to a third of a stop. So whenever you touch the dial and you want to change, if you use manual or something, and you try to move the dial, each little bit is a third of a stop. Have a look at these diagrams about how you can increase or decrease the amount of light by just setting the different values for shutter speed. If we're at 1/400th of a second shutter speed and want to double the brightness of the image, we can just double the time that shutter is open for. 1/200 is twice as long as 1/400, right? If we wanted to make it twice as bright again, we'd add another stop to the shutter speed and we would make it 1/100. So the difference between 1/400 and 1/100 is actually two stops. So you've gone 1/400, 1/200, 1/100. Two stops, and it's twice as bright each time, making it eventually 4 times brighter. Now look at the same diagram for ISO. To double the light, we can add a stop to the ISO by doubling it from ISO 400 to ISO 800. Or if we wanted to halve the light, we can remove a stop by halving it from ISO 400 to ISO 200. So it's a lot easier with ISO. It's literally double, double, double. Whereas with shutter speed, it's like 1/half, 1/half. So it's a bit more confusing. And now finally, look at the aperture version. For aperture, it's slightly different. Taking a stop off f4 would take us to f2.8. It would help if you can remember these, but it doesn't matter too much because, as I said, cameras work in a third of a stop. So you can spin the wheel 3 times and it will add a stop on. It will go from f4 to f3.5 to f3.2 to f2.8 to get to that one stop of added light there. f2.8, it's one stop more light than f4. So now you know how to add and remove stops of light from any of the 3 elements of exposure. What you might have already figured out is now you can transfer the stops between all 3 of them. So say you took a stop off one of them, you could add it to the other one, or vice versa. So if you take one stop off the shutter speed, for example, you can add a stop to the aperture. Look at this real world example I made. The first example will give us the same exposure as the second example, but as we can see, the values have changed. Now look at this one. The settings are completely different, but we've added and subtracted an equal amount of stops, so the exposure is going to be the same. Our aperture value was f4 and now it's f2.8, which will give us a shallower depth of field and also compensate one of the 3 stops of light that we lost on the ISO. So if we left our shutter speed up at 1/1000, we'd be 2 stops underexposed still. We had to take a hit though by halving our shutter speed and then halving it again, because those 2 stops had to come somewhere, didn't they? So the idea is you get a balance of what you want based on what pictures you think you're going to be taking. So I've got one last thing to cover before we wrap this all up. And that's, if you notice, I mentioned underexposure just a minute ago. Look at this image I took in Indonesia. In the middle, you can see the image is exposed based on the camera's correct exposure. And you can see on the left, the image is underexposed by 1 stop. On the right, it's overexposed by 1 stop. So the difference between the left and the right is actually 2 stops. Notice the difference in just 2 stops. It's important that you try and expose correctly if you can, but sometimes you might need to underexpose. I'm not going to go too much over that in this. That's one for another video, why you do that, but just something to be aware of. Anyway, I've covered a lot today, and I hope you understood most of it. It was difficult to get the right order to do this all in, because I didn't want to start explaining something without having explained something else that was more important and relevant to that thing. So it's kind of hard to get it all in the right order. If this has helped you at all and you want to get off auto, then I have another video that I'm also releasing today, which is called Get Off Auto or something. And basically, it will go through all the different modes and explain to you how to do each one and give you my one that I use 95% of the time. And it's not manual or auto. So if you want to find out, watch that video. But yeah, otherwise, comment anything if you've got any comments to add, anything to tell me. Any questions, comment down below, and otherwise subscribe and like, and see you next time.